Now I start the recording. So hello everyone, thanks for joining us. This is a webinar series of GSE Alumni Association. In this webinar series, we invite alumni of GSE who are successful in different areas. And today we have Kamila Rollan with us. Kamila is a graduate of Master of Science in Educational Leadership Program. The specialization is Inclusive Education, class of 2018. She was one of the founders of Education for All, a non-profit organization aimed at supporting inclusive education development in Kazakhstan. And apart from that, Kamila is author of many articles published in very quality journals. And also currently, Kamila is pursuing her PhD at the University of Cambridge, researching inclusive education reform development in Central Asia. Kamila, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Aidana, for inviting and for introducing. It's really nice to see everybody, to get in touch with my dear friends and colleagues back. I am based in Cambridge right now, and as any person in the UK, I think I should start with a small talk about the weather. The weather today is, it's a really gray and gloomy day. It's not sunny, it's cold. Makes us all feel a little bit miserable here, especially during the lockdown. And this is why I think that this talk, this reconnection with a new GSE is the only thing that really lightens up my day today. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity. I will take a second to open my slides because I've prepared some small presentation. And today I really would like to talk about my own learning journey when I moved here around a year and a half ago, and I started learning about inclusion and diversity here in the context of UK. Now, I am just in the beginning of this learning journey, so I might not have all the answers to the questions. In case we're going to have some Q&A, I might not be able to answer questions because it's a different experience here. I mean, we've been all taught at a new GSE that inclusion is a very flexible and context-based concept. In Kazakhstan, it's largely and vastly focused around disability, and UNESCO definition is a very broad one. We learned this. Now, knowing this theoretically and experiencing it firsthand, it's a very different lived experience. And I definitely faced a lot of challenges here when I started these discussions about diversity and inclusion with other students and faculty at Cambridge. And as a person with a lot of strong opinions myself, which doesn't necessarily help me in life, I face a lot of dilemmas right now when I have to think about inclusion and diversity, especially because I was elected to serve as equalities officer at my college at Cambridge. And that means on behalf of the student community, I am responsible for facilitating discussions about diversity and inclusion and ensuring that our college implements the principles of diversity, inclusion, and belonging in our policies and practices. And that is a challenge because some of the initiatives proposed by students, I even didn't vote for them just because I felt like what I know about this and my opinion is not yet solidified because there is just so much dilemmas around this. And so this is something that I would like to share. It's a very friendly discussion of my own learning points, and I hope to be able to discuss it with peers and maybe to get some insight from colleagues. So yeah, it's a very informal lecture, just another perspective on inclusion and diversity. Now, I would like to start this discussion with this legal case. And the thing that surprised me about inclusion, for example, here in the UK, and I believe in many other Western states, is that inclusion is a matter of policy and law enforcement, and not just discussions and discourse about our values. So in Kazakhstan right now, when we talk about promoting inclusion, the majority of the arguments are focusing on our values. So they're value-based discussions, while here it's very strongly supported by certain legislation. And to start this conversation about the legal side of inclusion, I went into the database of different cases that were raised in the court. And one of them was this case against L'Oreal company. And what happened there is that in 2005, one of the employees, the sales manager, Eliza Yanovich, filed a lawsuit against one of the general managers of the company, Jack Wiswall, because Mr. Wiswall expressed discriminatory attitudes when he pointed at one of the white blonde sales associates and said that we need more of employees like that. And he was making the case to fire one of the employee of color, even though her sales records were good. So that was really just a case of racial discrimination. And obviously, Yanovich won this case. And there was just a history of similar lawsuits around the world against L'Oreal company, saying that their recruitment policies, that their treatment of their employees and the treatment of their customers through the products that they develop and through their marketing strategies is expressing discriminatory, exclusionary principles and values. And it's funny to see that right now on the website of L'Oreal company, they're one of the positions or vacancies opened is actually a position of head of diversity and inclusion for the region of UK and Ireland. And it's a position based in London, it's associate level, so it's a very well-paid position. And it just shows the shift, the historical shift from L'Oreal being company with a history of lawsuits, and now L'Oreal being company who really tries to put its efforts and resources into building a strong team of people who can deliver their policy on inclusion, diversity, equality, and belonging. And whenever I just go through similar vacancies on LinkedIn, I'm surprised that almost any reputable company today, and here you see some examples like Amazon and Lego and Metropolitan Police in UK and London, all those reputable companies and organizations put their efforts into building strong team that can deliver diversity and inclusion results to the company. And what at the focus of inclusion are really those principles of equality and fair treatment. And when we speak of equality, it's mostly about equality of rights or equality of opportunities and equality of treatment rather than equality of outcomes. And for me, that's important distinction because in Kazakhstan, I personally heard many times people, for example, who argue against feminism saying, well, if you support feminism, then go and work on the factory. And here it's important distinction that equality of outcomes, such as, for everybody to work on the factory, that's not what feminism is trying to achieve, or, inclusion agenda is trying to achieve, but it's rather about equality of rights. If you want to go and work for the factory, should you be able to do it? If you go to the gym, should you be able to to do heavy weightlifting, or you should be deprived of this right just based on your gender? And I think common sense based on this example would tell us that you cannot be discriminated based upon that. If you want to do heavy lifting, then go ahead and do it. So it's really about equality of rights and equality of opportunities, and as well as the fair treatment. So despite our individual characteristics, we should all be treated fairly and equally, and that should contribute to our well-being. So the principles of inclusion and well-being are so interconnected right now that, for example, here at our college, as equalities officer, I always work in close contact with well-being officers because a lot of our initiatives are very interconnected. And the last principle that I think should be highlighted when we speak about inclusion is really the principle of affirmative action. For those, for example, in Kazakhstan that might not be well aware of this principle, because it's something very well promoted in the discourse of the Western countries and not as much of our countries, you can think about something that we in Russian call сельская квота, which is support of students from rural and remote areas, for example, when they are applying for universities. And we know that universities allocate a certain number of places to for students from rural or remote areas. even though somebody from the city, from Astana or Almaty might have better records, there is still certain percent of places allocated for just students from rural areas because they didn't have the fair start and they are less privileged. And we know from research that usually students from rural areas have lower academic performance. So you can imagine that if you happen to be born and raised and educated in a rural area, your chances to get to university, just because of the way the educational resources are distributed and structured, your chances are lower. And so affirmative action is about providing an advantage to those who are less privileged. In Russian, the best translation would be позитивная дискриминация, positive discrimination, but rather in English, that's the term that is used more often. And there are many debates around this. And in my own head, I've been also thinking a lot, what is my position on affirmative action? Because I understand the arguments against it, the arguments of meritocrats, but that's something that we're going to discuss a bit later on when I will move to main philosophical arguments against inclusion. But those are the principles that form this whole philosophy of inclusion and diversity. And at the focus of this principle are all kinds of groups, including vulnerable groups. So that means that, despite your individual characteristics such as age, disability, race, gender, religion, or lack of any religious belief and other characteristics, you are still entitled to be treated equally, fairly, and to be included in education and in the workplace. Speaking, for example, of racial diversity and racial inclusion, here I'm a member of one of the BAME subcommittees, Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic subcommittees. And this subcommittee really focuses on all the efforts to increase and enhance the diversity of racial representation and inclusion at the college. So this is something that in Kazakhstan, for example, is not widely discussed, is not on the agenda, racial equality, even though we are ethnically diverse region and country. It's usually not something highlighted as a special principle for inclusion, although we have a variety of other documents that support this principle of friendship of nations, as we say, дружба народов, and that's something that has been historically driven from Soviet times. But yes, here in the context of UK, these are the most common groups that pop out when we open up discussions about inclusion and diversity. Talking a little bit about definitions, because sometimes I use the word inclusion, sometimes I use the word diversity, and sometimes I use the word equality. All of those concepts are relevant, and sometimes you see different abbreviations mixing those letters, such as D and I, DEI, diversity, equality, inclusion, DIB. So what do these concepts mean? Diversity is mostly about representation of different diverse groups. So it's almost that you can quantify it. If you open the reports of Google company and Microsoft company for 2020, for the last year, if you look at their reports on inclusion diversity, you see the actual numbers and charts. What's the percentage of females versus males in the company? What's the percentage of Asians and different people of color? And you can see the almost the numerical representation of variety of different groups. Equality is more about the principle and the value of treating everybody fairly. Inclusion is rather about actions. What do you actively do with this diversity? How do you ensure that these diverse people can cooperate together and feel well, and their talented are appreciated, and this diversity is celebrated? So really, inclusion is about action plan. And belonging is an outcome of it, and it's the feeling of psychological belonging, how you feel connected to the place where you work or where you study. So if diversity, I would say in a very simplifying way, if diversity is rather about numbers, equality is about the principle and philosophy, inclusion is about actions, and belonging is the outcome and the feeling and the well-being of people. Which is why you see these different variations of mixing these different concepts together, and therefore different abbreviations like DNI or DIB. Some of the most common criticism against inclusion, diversity, and this whole principle come from two main schools of thought, the libertarians and the meritocrats. What is libertarianism? The main value of libertarians is individual freedom and individual rights. So it's all about me, my rights, my possessions, which is why it is a philosophy that very much supports competition, almost like a Darwinian view, the survival of the fittest. And this is something that the market in the United States, for example, looks like. It's a very competitive market. It doesn't have strong socialist policies like, for example, some Scandinavian countries. And so libertarians would rather support opening of private schools, the whole idea of private schooling, and they would not like the idea to be forced to, for example, go into mainstream school and be educated with everybody else, because if you have a right and opportunities to live in a bubble, for example, live in the elitist bubble, it's your right and nobody can take that right away from you. The libertarians would often be against, for example, progressive taxation. If I earn more money, why should I give a larger percent of my income to support underprivileged groups? I don't care about that. I would rather take this money and go, send my kids to private school and private educational providers. So you can see why libertarians would not be necessarily supportive of inclusion unless you make the argument about inclusion in the quantifiable sense. For example, one of the arguments how you can convince libertarians is saying that companies that are more diverse and have stronger inclusive policies usually are more efficient and produce better outcomes. And this is when libertarians will be convinced, because you're saying that with diversity, you can win competition. Another argument against inclusion is meritocratic argument. Why should we, for example, support affirmative action? Why should we support students from rural areas? If they don't have same academic performance, maybe they just didn't work hard enough. And some other student from Almaty or Astana, from NIS school, for example, he or she was working hard enough. It's really about what you deserve. It's not about, it is fair treatment. We just take the same measurement scale and we treat everybody with the same measurement scale. Why would that be unfair? And a common reply to meritocrats would be that we are born with inborn inequalities in our society. For example, if you're coming from NIS school, you are coming from a school which is much more resourceful, which is much better off than some other schools. So you can see, for example, that in Nazarbayev University, the majority of undergraduate students would be coming from such schools as NIS, schools that are supposed to be for gifted children. And that really shows that our university supports meritocracy to a great extent, which is not bad, but which does ignore, to a certain extent, the innate inequalities that we have when we're born. Some of the things we cannot influence them. For example, you might think that there were two kids going in the second grade and one of them did their homework, the other one didn't. Maybe the other one didn't because he didn't just work hard enough. But then you might potentially ignore the fact that this kid who didn't do his homework, the situation in his family might be more worse. Maybe they don't have electricity. Maybe he struggles because his parents are not having healthy relationship dynamic between them, and therefore the kid is affected by arguing, by fights at home, or by divorce process and things like that. So it's not really about who deserves it, but we also should see about the conditions at the start and who is more privileged. And sometimes this privilege can be very subtle. So in this world today, the libertarian meritocratic arguments are kind of failing in front of the egalitarian argument, which is really forcing inclusion and affirmative action, supporting those who are less well off. And yet we cannot say that this is that means that meritocracy is bad and it's not implemented right now in institutions. No. For example, you see the Cambridge University, which is by no means an inclusive university. It's a very elitist educational institution. On their Department of Equality and Diversity webpage, you see that they actually highlight that their policy for equality is based on personal merit and by performance. So that's a very meritocratic take on inclusion. So if you would ask me, is Cambridge inclusive? I would say to a small fraction, because in principle, it is an elitist institution, so it's not open up to everybody. However, inside this institution, when we are already here, there are still some inequalities among us, among the students and the members and the faculty of the Cambridge University. So there is still a department that works on inclusion and diversity here, just focusing on those students that are already here. So yes, in principle, we're not inclusive, but in this elitist environment, we're still applying inclusion and diversity principles to a certain extent. So as we all know, and as, for example, our professor Michelle has always been saying, inclusion is rather a process. We're not saying that we're trying to get somewhere, but we see that everybody is having their own personal journey towards that. If we would speak about education in the UK, by no means I am a specialist on that. So what I can only say is that definitely here the preference for the type of schooling is always mainstream schooling. So no matter what is the personal characteristic of a child, what the income level of a child, and whether a child has special educational needs, it is legally, all the kids are legally obliged to go to mainstream schools where possible. But the exclusions can be made. So some kids can choose to go to special educational providers. And in general, families who have education and health and healthcare plan, they have additional budget, so they can they have a choice. But in principle, the education is rather guided by this whole idea that everybody should be educated together in mainstream setting for the majority, for the major part of the day. And there is certain legislation to support that, such as, for example, the Equality Act, which prohibits any direct or indirect discrimination towards students. So, for example, we understand what direct discrimination means, but some of the ways how students can be indirectly discriminated is that if we don't diversify our curriculum, if we don't differentiate our curriculum, and we apply same assessment techniques, for example, same assessment measurements to all the students. So in an indirect way, that will discriminate against somebody with special educational needs, because for them, that measuring scale might be too challenging. So the Equality Act prohibits that type of discrimination as well as discrimination arising from disability. And if we would look on discrimination at the workplace, because here there is always a very strong connection made between education and employment. When we speak about inclusion, people understand that the ultimate purpose of inclusion is not just to ensure inclusion in school, but also to make sure that people, when they grow up and when they join the job market, can be competitive and can partake in the process and can be independent. So equality principle very much translates into workplace right now, and that's something that is a big area of discussion. And if we would look at some of the policy drafts, so for example, this is one of the policy templates developed by one of the very renowned D&I specialists in the UK, Mark Lomas. So he drafted this policy template for any company really to use. And here we see that the EDI policy focuses on creating inclusive values to ensure that the company, and in all of its stages, when it recruits talents, when it recruits employees, when it treats employees, when it thinks about its customers, that it sticks to the principle of inclusion. So attracting, recruiting, developing, and retaining talented people at all levels should be implemented with the idea of inclusion in mind. So everybody should have equal opportunity in this procurement process and a fair treatment. Sexuality, gender, race, culture, all these aspects of diversity eventually translate into diversity of thinking, in diversity of minds, into the cognitive diversity of our company. And therefore, the more there are ideas and really brains engaged in the company, that means the performance of the company is also better. So the discourse is really that diversity is something that is beneficial to the company's well-being. And every company should have an action plan to tackle discrimination. So there should be a clear action plan, probably with some measurements, some indicators, how we as a company can tackle discrimination. And no matter what your ethnicity is, or your gender, or your terms of employment, everybody should be treated equally in terms of not just how you're treated, but also, for example, how you're paid. For example, in Cambridge, there was, in the beginning of my PhD journey, there were 2 university strikes, one by one. And the main argument of the people who started the strike was to promote inclusion, especially when it comes to fair treatment and fair allocation of resources and fair pay. And that was something that even Cambridge still struggles. So here we can see that inclusion, diversity, and belonging is supported on the policy level, and each company has policy on that and a set of indicators. And I just showed you one of the simple templates for you to kind of grasp the idea. The argument for inclusion is also right now an economical argument. And if we would look at the research made by Deloitte company, we see that the results of research was that more diverse companies show more innovation and risk reduction in their work. We see that there's a bunch of, this is a very long report, so I just added a bunch of graphs here just to show you some of the idea for this case for inclusive culture in the company. But it's argued that inclusive companies are more high performing, 6 times more innovative and agile, 8 times more likely to achieve business outcomes. And you can see the source here, and if you're interested, you can screenshot and then take a look at that research and how those measurements have been made. And especially there are strong results on inclusive leadership. So inclusive leadership is definitely one of the most important components of promoting inclusion at any level, may it be education or organization. And in companies where leadership is inclusive, we see that the individual feeling of inclusion, so how the employees actually feel on the ground, is 70% higher than in those companies that leaders are not following the principles of inclusion. And therefore, as a result, we see that there is an increase in team performance, in decision-making quality, and in team collaboration. So there is right now a strong case made for inclusion in companies, which is not just value-based and legal-based, but it's also based on these indicators of efficiency and performance. And if you would look at some of the profiles of the most leading and the most innovative companies in the world, because I think we can arguably claim that most of the innovations right now happen actually not in the academia or in governments, but most of the innovations are made by corporations and startup companies, for example. So we see that those companies, the corporations right now, very much support the idea of diversity and inclusion in their policy agenda. And if you would look almost any website of any company, and here's just a screenshot of Apple company, it's on their diversity webpage, this big poster saying that Apple is really supportive of cognitive diversity. So the diversity of its staff is translated into a diversity of minds and thinking. And by thinking together, we can create more innovative products and to deliver better to the experiences of our customers, because obviously customers of Apple are very diverse. It's people from all over the world, and therefore having a diverse workforce is vital for its company's success and innovation. And we see it not just in employment, but also in one of the leading educational institutions. For example, Harvard. It's just as an example. You can see that they have a whole board of diversity, inclusion, and belonging leaders. So each faculty has a dean of DIB. So you can see the DIB of Faculty of Arts, DIB of Faculty of Humanities, of Engineering. And in each faculty, this person is responsible for ensuring that all the policies, the way the students are selected and the way they're treated, everything is implemented with an idea of inclusion in mind. And I started reading some of these biographies of these DIB deans, and one of them has been appointed quite recently. And for me, it was something that I've never experienced, and I never thought about that it would escalate to such level. Because in Kazakhstan, I was thinking in local context, and I was focusing on the issues at the agenda today, and therefore I was focusing more of inclusion of primary and secondary school level and of children with disabilities. While when I go to Apple website or to Harvard, I start seeing what a big way to go. But am I trying to make the case that this is something that we should implement in Kazakhstan tomorrow? I am not brave enough to make this case yet. And rather, I am reflecting right now on such questions as I posted here. Is there a need for diversity and inclusion policies in Kazakhstan? Should that be a legal matter? Should you be able to file a lawsuit against someone in case you're being treated unfairly? And in case Kazakhstan needs inclusion and diversity, then my question is, how would Kazakhstan frame it? For example, the LGBTQIA+ community, we know how that is a sensitive issue and a sensitive group when we speak about the context of Kazakhstan. Here, their advocacy power and political support is so strong that even I sometimes feel overwhelmed. So some of the initiatives around inclusion of LGBTQIA community here, to be honest, I just abstained from voting because to me that seemed like way too much, and I felt like it's just politically backed to an extent that it's not very reasonable anymore. But that's just my own personal opinion. I might be wrong because obviously I come here from a very different context. And so then I thought, but in Kazakhstan, would that be someone at the focus? And if yes, to what extent? If not, then why? So that's something I'm thinking, how would that be framed in our country? And I always think, what is my personal take on that? Because here, as a GSB qualities officer for Cambridge, I need to be aware of the policies of the university and to be able to deliver them. But if I will come back, when I will come back to Kazakhstan, if I will start working in that area back in my country, what will be my personal take on that? As hopefully a leader in this area, what would I be advocating for, and why? And that's the main question for me. What are my underlying assumptions and biases behind this position? Why do I support the ethnic diversity in Kazakhstan? And what would I say if in Kazakhstan we wanted to open the gender expression fund? For example, here in Cambridge, we have this gender expression fund. So if a student needs to apply for some equipment that should help you to express your gender better, for example, a wig, or there's just a bunch of different things that I don't even know how to call them. Students can apply for that funding. If I would be in Kazakhstan, I would most likely not initiate such a thing. And my question to myself is why? What is my underlying assumption about this? And am I right or wrong? So those are the questions and dilemmas that right now I'm facing. And I'm really urging all of my colleagues to also think about those questions, because at the end of the day, we're the ones who will be making the future of this country and the present of this country. So we are defining the new norm. We are defining our values and what we want to promote and advocate for. And to be able to do that effectively, we should be able to firstly reflect deeply on those questions. So this is something that I wanted to share today. I hope that was informative, maybe a bit shallow, because again, I'm just really in the beginning of this learning journey. But I should say that my learning curve since I arrived here has been much more steep. I'm learning so much every day here, and I'm very blessed by opportunities here, even though I don't agree with everything that Cambridge does. And I think it's way too liberal, or I'm way too centric for Cambridge. I am very much grateful for the opportunities it gives me, as well as I'm grateful for this platform to be able to discuss it with my community back in Kazakhstan by this GSE Alumni series. So thank you for attention. And if you would want to comment on that, I am very glad to hear your feedback.
Thank you very much, Kamila, for this very informative and in a way, I mean, very, very new information. I myself was just, like very interested, didn't know about such maybe things, examples, or situation in the world. So my question will be not the question, but reflection. Like when you talk about this inclusive people or responsible people in the workplaces or educational institutions, I myself as a learner or a parent of the learner, I will be very happy if my school where my kid goes will have that specialist. Not that even though there are like other people, teachers and school admins who are there and will be ensuring that all the policies at the school level is implemented and in practice. I will mostly, kind of trust if there is a person you can go and ask directly, okay, this is the case, what is the policy or what is it the cases, what's your recommendations? I mean, as an expert. So thank you very much. And I think this kind of thoughts and talks helps us to define more what inclusive education specialists can do in Kazakhstan, how we can present more, how we can help overall in society and the workplaces to improve their overall experience in inclusive education. So thank you very much, Kamila. So the
Thank
floor
you.
is open for any questions.
I very much agree with the comment you made, and it made me think that when I think about our Kazakhstani schools, if I think about the supporting staff, such as psychologists or social pedagogues, most of them deal with troubles, right? You think that kids are only sent to psychologists in case there is some trouble, or the social pedagogue is responsible for kids from disadvantaged families. Now, what if I am not coming from a family that is openly disadvantaged, but I still care about my well-being? Is there some person to whom I can go, not being identified as someone in need of special support, and just express my concerns about my well-being? I think not. And that's something that I think what you say, having the staff who would work on inclusion in this broader sense would be good, because as I said, inclusion and well-being are very interrelated concepts. So it would be nice to know that there's someone in the school who just cares about well-being of everybody, not just focusing on those who are in need of additional support, but just on everybody, because at every point we're all in need of some additional support. It's not a permanent condition. And I think that's a very good comment, and it made me think that so far we don't have such personnel in school, and it's a pity to see that right now people who are appointed as inclusive education support staff, so methodistas, as we say, right? So the Methodists for inclusive education or inclusive education specialists in school, they're again transforming into someone who just needs to deal with all the troubles or additional needs, and not viewed as someone who is there just to support well-being, just to make sure that we all feel good when we go to school.
Thank you, Kamila. So dear participants, you have the opportunity to ask the questions, give the reflections. Please use this opportunity.
May I ask? Sorry.
Sure.
I just wanted to build on the point that you just made, Kamila, about schools in Kazakhstan. And I think, the idea of whether it be social support or any other kind of support, particularly in the realms of education, means that you are somehow, you are then pushed towards the idea of special education. Whereas the idea in Western countries like the UK and of course Australia is more the idea that every person may need support at some point in their life. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily, they have a disability, that it's a lifelong disability. They might have some kinds of needs, but we're very much in this context prone to categories. We like to place people and things into categories because that really is, I think, one of the historical sort of legacies of the Soviet system, where everything was categorized. So you must be put into a category because then we can deal with you a certain way. Whereas when we see in Western countries like the UK and Australia and Canada and other places, there is just a broader acceptance of the idea of inclusion, rather than inclusion being something because you are disadvantaged, not necessarily disadvantaged, but having a disability and requires some special treatment in some way. I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, thank you.
So, Kamila, thank you so much for your discussion about inclusion. And I wanted to know your thoughts about cancel culture, because I think it's really connected to inclusion. Inclusion became like one of the trends, I think, that everyone is promoting it and enhancing it. And I like how you discussed that it's a really difficult matter and we can't really like fully understand what is a good decision and what is not. But I think that the cancel culture is really closely connected with inclusion, and it's making like canceling everyone who isn't supporting some like general beliefs. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. And, you know, it made me think that maybe it's not exactly what you mean, but it made me think that, for example, here in Cambridge, people are different, people are diverse, but they're kind of same in a way that everybody's, for example, I can assume that 99% here would be against Trump, would be very much for, you know, economically liberal or socially liberal agendas, especially social liberal agendas. And for example, if I want to go out there and say, hey, for example, I don't necessarily support this new initiative on LGBTQIA inclusion in that sense, that this particular thing that we want to do, then I feel like I become a victim of the cancel culture, because my opinion is canceled just because the majority is for it. And then it brings me back to the question, are we really speaking about diversity here? Because while in worrying too much about diversity of representation of different groups, something the visible diversity, I still think that there is a big component of ignoring the cognitive diversity and opinions. And it's tricky because, you know, if I think back, for example, right, if I think that someone in Kazakhstan really wants to silence the issue of unfair treatment of girls in marriage, for example, I really want to cancel them. I want to say, hey, your opinion doesn't matter because it's a horrible opinion. But what teaches me here right now in Cambridge is to try actively to seek for middle grounds, because here right now, I am against some of these policies for inclusion of LGBTQIA in that sense that they want to do it here, not because I think I'm a bad person or I don't understand the issue, but because I have different perspective on that. I have different things that I would like to focus on. And so I'm trying to apply this thinking back to some of the people that I used to argue a lot in Kazakhstan. And I'm really trying to develop the skill of building dialogue with any person, unless it's a psychopath, but, you know, trying to build a dialogue and reach some middle grounds, or to be able to talk on the level of pure arguments without involving emotions. Because I think canceling, you know, cancel culture is very emotionally driven. It's not very, if you make an, you know, argument for that, you most likely wouldn't win. It's just something emotionally driven. So yeah, I think it's a very good question. And as I say, it goes in different directions. You know, as someone, you know, sometimes I can support cancel culture or not consciously support, but be an embodiment of cancel culture back in my home country, while here I started feeling like a victim of it. And it's a spectrum, and that's something that also is a good topic for discussion and reflection.
Thank you so much for your answer.
And what are your thoughts on that? I'm just thinking, because I think when you've been asking this question, you had something in your mind, probably some particular idea or situation.
Yes, I think that the majority isn't looking for different perspectives. And I think that the cancel culture is preventing us from reaching like true inclusion and promoting it, because we are not taking like other sides. And I often think about the case of Joanne Rowling, because even though she discriminated trans people in some like to some extent, she also raised another question about women's safety. And I think it's really difficult topic, and it's really difficult to convince other people that cancel culture can bring harm as well.
I agree with you. I think you put it very, very nicely and eloquently what you said. So I very much support your idea on that. Seeing things in black and white, and for example, disclaiming everything that Joanne Rowling does just because she might have expressed some attitudes towards transgender people, I don't think that's a fair treatment. Yeah, thank you for this question, for your reply back.
Thank you too.
Hi, Kamila.
Hello.
Not so long ago, our professor, Michelle, introduced you to us as inclusive education first year.
Mhm.
And watching you today presenting on inclusive, and I can just see the passion that you have around this. It's really amazing. And I wish you all the best. I am Bernard Matsuso. I'm from South Africa. And I actually resonate with a whole lot of issues that we have raised. And quite interesting using Cambridge as a case. You've mentioned that according to them, it is an inclusive university, it's diverse, but in reality, it's not. I mean, in practice. So you still have people who feel somehow that they don't have access to certain things. So I just wanted to find out from your experience, in terms of university leadership, do they have monitoring and evaluation system in place to track these issues? Because if you are an inclusive university or society, there should be someone who is actually providing an oversight role, because this is a continuous progress. We don't stop today to say we have transformed our institution, therefore we are done with this project. There will still be elements on a daily basis that defeats that purpose. For example, in the case of my university here in South Africa, we also say we are an inclusive university. We accommodate almost all students coming from different backgrounds, especially your LGBTQI students. So once these students are now part of the university, they don't have access to certain things in terms of health, counseling, and certain information they don't have access to, but the university says it's very diverse and inclusive. So I just want to hear from you, if you were to relate your experience with Cambridge, like, do they have monitoring and evaluation systems to root out some of these discrepancies that students who are already in the university do somehow feel that they're being excluded?
Yeah, thank you for, number one, your feedback, and for the questions. Really nice question. And the short answer would be yes, there is some monitoring and evaluation framework to monitor inclusion at Cambridge. But as always, things are not as simple, right? Things are always a little bit more complicated than they seem from the first sight. Cambridge is a very decentralized institution. So there is not such building in the whole city of Cambridge that you can point and say, this is my university, because it's just created out of a variety of different departments and faculties and colleges. And in this very diverse system, I think to have one overarching system of monitoring is very challenging. So even though there are reports and we can access them on the website and we can see what are the reports for inclusion, diversity, and whatsoever. For example, did somebody ask me my contribution to how I feel, how included I feel? No. So even though there are constant evaluation going on, it's a good question, what is the methodology of that? Maybe they only look at the numerical statistical data, or they make some surveys, but they don't distribute to every college, or I don't know why that information never reaches me. Because if I needed to give my personal reflection as a student, I would definitely say that Cambridge is far away from being inclusive, not only because it is elitist in its foundational design, right? Because it's, you can only get here if you have certain GPA, and if you have certain funding secured for you, either through some grants, scholarships, sponsors, or wealthy parents, or just you're a wealthy person who earned this money yourself. There is just a bunch of exclusionary criteria and inclusionary criteria how you can get to Cambridge and who cannot get here. And then, even though they're being elitist and in its foundation, when we see here the student community and how we feel day to day, how we experience being in Cambridge day to day, I still wouldn't say that it's very inclusive, but I do see that there are a lot of efforts going on. But sometimes I think that, as I just said, the focus is too much on what is your race and what is your gender and what is your pronoun, and much less on how are you different, in terms of how you think and how you view the world. Because the diversity of mindsets is something that I think here is a very tricky topic. As I said, if I would openly talk about some of my positions here, I could be just classified as somebody who is a bad person, and I can become a victim of this cancel culture that was raised before. So I think that there is still a long way to work on that here in Cambridge. And even though the university presents itself as a pioneer in that, I would say that this is just a very beautiful facade. But beside this, behind this facade, there is still a world of things to do. And one of the very obvious things is, for example, how much Black students we have here. It's a very, very small minority. I think my class in the Faculty of Education is just all of us are Asians. I don't know how it happened, but like 90% of us are Asians. There are some white people, and there's just 2 Black people, and you see it when you walk in the city, so you understand that even though the university does a lot, and I think most of the people here would agree with me. So people here at Cambridge themselves, they know these things, that they're aware that they're elitist institution. It still shows that there is much to do. And maybe there's also much to do in terms of how we can improve the monitoring and evaluation system here at Cambridge. So yeah, thank you for your question. And it really makes me think about a lot of things, what I can do here as well. So really nice discussion to have with all of you, everybody here at the new GSE community.
Can I just add to that, Kamila? Because it reminds me of one of the conflicts that I actually had in coming to Kazakhstan, coming from a Western culture. And, coming to what I saw was, from the outset, a very elitist university, Nazarbayev University, English medium of instruction university. So, what students really across Kazakhstan have access to learning English to a level that they could actually be able to enter a master's degree. And I was very conflicted by that decision. Do I apply for the position and do I accept it when I was offered it? Do I come and I work into an institution that I fundamentally see goes against my values, inclusive education? And I do make the distinction here between inclusion and inclusive education. But at the same time, I had to ask myself the question, well, if I don't, who will? And what change can I make? So often we are working within systems. It doesn't matter whether we're working within Australian systems or UK systems, but there, it is something that is ongoing. It is something that we have to work all the time to be reflective and reflexively think about our own position in the system that is perhaps perpetuating, inequalities. So it is something, unfortunately, that we all have to deal with. But I think being mindful of it and being very critical about our own role and our own purpose in that journey is really important. So yeah, that was something that really, resonated with me, that whole journey of actually being or having to place yourself into a system that is inherently against what your values are.
Yeah, I agree with that fully. And I agree that it's not an excuse to just not accept, those offers to go to Nazarbayev University or for me to go to Cambridge. And it's not for us to judge these institutions by no means, but it's for us to get involved and then to be critical and then to think what we can bring to that and how we can improve it, and through our critical thinking and reasoning bring some suggestions for improvement. And that's why I decided to do this work around as an inequalities officer here, even though there's still so much for me to learn and I'm so full of such strong opinions, but it's a learning journey for me. And it's also an evolution of the college, because at the end of the day, I am also a member of the college and I know that I can contribute something valuable. So I change and grow, and the community here through people like me and other people changes and grows. And that is, I think, really makes the point that you've been always telling us. This is a process. Inclusion and inclusive education, those are processes rather than just final destination that we can reach or some indicator. So we are in this process and trying to do our best in that.
Thank you, Kamila.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think, I will finish with it. My only words on this is, if you don't, then who will?
Yeah.
So do we have any other last minute questions? There are some comments in the chat box, Kamila.
Yeah, I see some comments. It's really nice. Thank you, everybody, for your feedback.
Okay, if we don't have any questions, we'll finalize and close our session. So I think it was very small group of discussing the inclusive education perspectives, but very thoughtful and very interesting discussion. Thank you, Kamila, again, for your acceptance of our offers, coming to GSE, presenting for us every time. We miss you. Hopefully we'll see you soon once we're back to the campus, once we have some alumni reunions like offline. Thank you very much. We wish you all the best. So we'll wait you some years after your successful graduation as a Dr. Kamila Rollan. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dana, for inviting and for warm words, and everybody else here. As you said, it was a small community, but sometimes I give lectures where there are hundreds of people and there is much less feedback than right now when it's a small group, but I just felt so connected. So thank you. And I do look forward to see everybody else live back in Kazakhstan. And for now, I'm just wishing everybody to have a good rest of the day and a good journey ahead in professional, personal learning journey. Enjoy this journey. We're all in this together and we will stay connected through it. So thank you and best of luck.
Thank you, Kamila. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.